I wouldn't buy this printer, not for a second. In many ways, this is the antithesis of a Bamboo Lab machine, which many of you know is a series of printers I have an incredible fondness for. So why then could I still happily recommend this to many people? Well, I'm a resin printer first and foremost. I only got into FDM printing because brands would send me them and I'm not one to turn down a free thing. And I still review them, but I do so from the point of view of someone who, like me, just wants a machine that works so I can focus more on my hobby. So I had to educate myself a bit more this time, and I was less than 2 minutes into Maker's Muse's incredible review when he talked about the hot end having a planetary geared extruder with a ceramic heater, and I realized that not only do I not know what any of those things are or what they mean in practical terms, I also don't care. I don't care so much that I don't care to even learn about these parts so that I suddenly do care. And I don't need to care because I'm not, and nor do I pretend to be, an FDM printing expert. Like you, I'm just a hobbyist, or in another way, I'm just a guy standing in front of an audience asking you to watch him. I'm Ross, and this is Fohammer Videos. But yeah, this printer made me reflect hard on my own reviews. That's right, I actually put thought into these things. I don't just sit around making up words. Okay, well technically that's exactly what I do, but these words are at least carefully considered. You'll see what I mean. And speaking of things well considered, this printer, I can happily say I'll be more positive about this than any of the Creality, Anycubic or Elegoo FDM machines I've touched so far, even though this is technically far more complicated to use. So what this is an FDM printer with a build volume of 350 by 350 by 345mm. Once assembled, the unit is over half a meter in width, depth and height too, so you'll need some space available if you're after this. Specifically, you need 55 by 55 by 58 centimeters, and that's without the spool holder mounted to the top right side. But I'm jumping ahead a bit. Unlike most printers I review which focus on user experience, this is a machine that I feel is aimed at the beginner printer enthusiasts, and that's printer enthusiasts, not printing enthusiasts. I'd put myself, and I suspect many of my viewers, comfortably in the latter camp. I'm led to understand that this printer is based on a Voron, and after very basically researching what that means, I'm only a little clearer, but it appears a Voron is less of a product and more of a design specification for a 3D printer that you can build yourself. And I don't just mean assemble like most other printers. You can go to Voron's website, pick a framework, tell it what dimensions you want your printer to be, and it'll give you a kit list down to the nuts and bolts for you to source yourself. Now, if you want to get into 3D printers as a hobby, this is more of the deep end. There are slightly simpler options out there, such as Voron kits, but again, little to nothing is pre-assembled. You will be building the machine almost from scratch. What Sovol has done is essentially made a Voron and minimized the assembly and sourcing you need to do to create a purchasable product based on the Voron design. So if you want to get into the technology of 3D printing, here's the shallow end of the pool. Now, in saying that, assembly this time is still more of a task than most other machines I typically use. Sovol, along with many other users, say assembly will take about an hour. For me, with all the breaks to film and script notes, it took me nearly 3 before I booted the machine up. And since unboxing and assembly is your first interaction with the machine, I must say Sovol are adding little helpful extras that even several of the more well-known companies don't. Little things like labeling the screw bags in the order of which you'll need first. So whilst there is a bit more to do here, it is straightforward. And it's a case of just place the upright frame pieces into the base, and these mostly hold themselves until you screw them into place. Place the upper frame on and screw that into place. The X and Y printing assembly though has its own frame, and this was a little trickier to slide into place, but once done, just screw it down, then mount the hot end which holds itself in place, and screw this in and connect a load of cables in various places, including flipping the machine over to connect the 2 motors underneath. But this is easy to follow thanks thanks to the handy instructions. Now I say handy, these aren't the best and could be translated better. Just one person who's a native English speaker reviewing them before publication could really help here, because they do get a bit worse as you go further through the manual. Externally, the machine has several ports. There's an internal PSU, so the power lead just plugs into the left side next to the rocker switch. On the right side, you have an Ethernet socket, 2 USB ports, and a HDMI cable to connect an add-on touchscreen display. And that doesn't come in the box, you'll have to pay extra for it. In the box is a basic monochrome control panel with a very simple text-based display and control dial with 3 functions. Clockwise moves your selection cursor right or down, counterclockwise does the opposite, and push this dial in to select. This is the first printer I've owned with such a basic display and control system, and whilst this is far more cumbersome than the average machine I review, once it was connected to my network I hardly used it because everything is controlled via the slicer. One thing I did get a kick out of though is I later realised if you want something a bit different, you can change the colour of this screen's backlight too, to a variety of RGB colours. Once the printer's running, there are a wee couple of auto calibrations to run. The machine does a lot of great auto detection. With the X and Y mechanism housed on its own gantry, each corner is belt driven, and the first thing the printer does is automatically level these to the bed. It also does bed leveling detection. However, the Z offset is a bit weird, and as mine showed some small signs of under extrusion or it was too high after the initial test, I had to lower this. But the way it instructs you to do it is odd. It seems you need to run the whole test again, which means all the leveling steps it does, and then just wait for it to start printing the base layer test. Then while it's printing, use the control knob to adjust it live mid-print. And if you don't get this done in time, well, I guess you've got to start again. However, I later learned you can actually make this adjustment during any print. I also found that adherence was solid on the included PEI plate, and it's nice to see there are some small guidance tabs on the rear edges of the plate to help get this square every time you remove it and replace it. Again, some of the more well-known brands don't even bother with this small but handy stuff. And the hot end unit has a removable faceplate which provides relatively easy access to the most important and most often replaced components. The filament mounts onto an arm on the upper right chassis and goes through a runout sensor into a PTFE tube which connects all the way to the hot end. Now, even though the controls were more cumbersome than a touchscreen, loading and unloading filament was straightforward and didn't require removal of the PTFE tube in order to coax the filament in or out. Though, when changing colours, the amount of purged filament isn't quite enough to clear the nozzle of the previous colour, so I've actually had to run it twice on most occasions. One thing this printer does have is a rubber nozzle wiper at the back corner of the plate, but so far in all of my testing, I've never once seen the printer use this. Instead, before every print, it expunges a large blob of material in the front left corner, and this surrounds the nozzle as it's expressed. Not sure this is really the best way, but I expect a firmware update or some G-code changes will resolve it. I'm probably just using the wrong profile because I used Orca Slicer, and not the version of Orca Slicer that you get on the USB drive, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Another nice feature is the inclusion of a 720p webcam mounted under the front right corner of the Z-axis gantry, and with this you can monitor your prints remotely and generate time lapses. One thing that a few people have pointed out, and is very legacy, is getting this printer connected to Wi-Fi. In order to do this, you need to update a document on the USB drive to include your Wi-Fi network's name or SSID and password, then insert that USB into the printer, reboot it, and then go to options and choose show IP. In my case, I couldn't get this working, probably due to my dual 2.4/5 GHz Wi-Fi band, because I've had issues before due to this. So I just plugged in an Ethernet cable in order to directly connect this to my router. My first 2 prints were both benches. I started with some orange bamboo filament I had spare, and I did the 11-minute bench sheet. I intended to use this to show that faster printers just mean a reduction in quality, as I've seen before, and whilst this is lower quality than the 20-minute Benchy I printed after it, it's still actually much better than most other machines. When it comes to slicer software for this printer, well, as I alluded to earlier, they just give you Orca, not Orca with a bunch of Sovol branding and UI changes that they felt necessary even though it's unnecessary. This is literally Orca on the USB drive, and I actually had a newer version already installed. So all you need to do is boot up Orca and add your printer. Connecting directly to it is no more difficult than clicking the Wi-Fi button in the slicer and adding the IP address. And all of these instructions are kinda clear enough in the haphazardly translated manual. It's not great, but it's enough to get by mostly following the pictures. But in my case, there was only one profile available in Orca, and this was for 0.2mm layers. But hey, it worked. And with it, I was able to print out some more parts from the kit kiln. In this case, it was this by and large lunchbox. And as I've said before, I'm really into the kit kiln prints. I've got multi-color printers that can do color swaps mid-print, but personally, because of all the time and filament this process wastes, I'm much happier printing these kits in separate colors and pushing them together. I think the big thing to note about this printer is that it's not aimed at those of us who want plug and play. Unlike my other printers, which auto-calibrate things like flow rate, some parts of these prints were a bit over-extruded, and as such not as neat as my personal favourite brand of machines out of the box. But that's not what this is about. This machine expects you to then run through a series of manual tests to dial in the settings for your filaments. And Orca will kindly walk you through this with built-in temperature tests, flow rate tests, pressure advance tests, and more. Again, it's kind of the point of this machine. You get this to learn 3D printers. It is open source, it is upgradable, and upgradable in many ways. You can, of course, get the screen from Sovol, you can get the enclosure kit, and a hardened steel hot end. I'd highly recommend doing something about the fan underneath, because this is just a little bit on the excessively loud side. Not deafeningly so, but louder than it needs to be when the printer's just idling. But if you're doing upgrades, you don't need to go the Sovol route, that's just the easier street. You could do more research and install your own, or community versions of either, or both. But where I love this so much more than printers from the brands I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is that this isn't pretending to be more than it is. Everyone else seems to be taking open source stuff and often locking it down, and they're even taking great open source slicers like Prusa and Orca and making them worse in a piss-poor attempt to make their printer more user-friendly and the slicer more on-brand. But more often than not, they don't. They screw it up and make it worse. It's like when you buy an Android-based phone from a brand and you get all that brand's versions of the main apps and the UI is all branded to them. They are and always will be one step behind a vanilla Android phone because they need to wait for the new versions of Android to build from. And when they do this and the phone ages, those brand customizations become outdated and more often than not abandoned. And we've seen the same with a lot of printers. Here, this is raw, this is vanilla, this is as bare bones as a printer based on this stuff should be, unless the brand are actually going to make it better. This software is as basic as it should be. So whilst this may be the opposite end of the spectrum from a Bamboo printer, it does what it intends to do, it does what it tells you it does fairly solidly. And I completely respect that and the people who want to buy into this side of the hobby. And honestly, if like me, you want to just avoid all the BS from the other brands, that's also another reason that this is a great place to start. And this price for a machine of this print volume, hell yes. This is genuinely encouraging even me to do more tinkering. If only I had more time, with this, I probably would. I want to say thanks for watching, with a huge thanks going to our members who are on screen now. Please consider joining them by signing up. You'll get early access, exclusive videos, and Discord roles on our server. Until next time, come with me if you want to live. Fohammer out.